Hi friend, I'm Wai Jia, and this is Dream Brave. Welcome to this great adventure. Without risk, there is no need for faith. Yet, so many of us hold back because the cost of saying yes seems too great. We forget that what we desperately hold on to is an illusion. The enchantment of security lulls us into taking risks every single day for ourselves, while being immune to the call of risk-taking love on the Calvary Road of Christ. In this special season on risk, I'm excited to interview ordinary Christians who've gone out on a limb to take extraordinary risks for God. My hope is that these stories will encourage you to put all you are on the line to obey God's call for your life, as you remember that thousands of decisions we make every single day put us closer to the cliff's edge than the occasional clarion call to obey God. May these stories change your perception of risk-taking and empower you to recalibrate risk so that you might, by faith, wisely take the risks He presents so you may be thrust forth into the adventure He has waiting for you. If God has called you, then no matter what the cost, the risk will always be worth it. When you hear the word risk, what do you think of? Do you imagine danger or adventure? I know I do. But what we often miss is the risk of staying where we are. The risk of never trying, of being stuck, of a lifetime of regret. Staying might feel safe and familiar, but it also risks all that we dreamed our reality could be. In this first episode of our season of risk, I thought to share with you a couple of stories that challenge my own definition of risk in my life. I remember growing up as a very sheltered child in a middle-income household. There was nothing that I actually lacked materially, and I was honestly growing up in a very protected, sterile bubble in Singapore. The first time I actually traveled overseas on my own, without my parents and family, but instead with a group of student leaders, was when I was 17 years old to Cambodia. And when I was 18, I then went alone by myself on a solo trip to visit a children's home in Nepal. How that happened sounds really far-fetched to me, because who would have thought that a little 18-year-old girl who had been sheltered and protected all her life would go into the thick of the Maoist uprising and political unrest in Nepal while there were bomb blasts and power cuts and burning flags all around the streets. But when I look back at my life, I realized that God has always guided every step that I made. And my hope is that as you listen to these stories, that you would not label yourself as being a risky or a not risky person, that you would not see yourself as someone who would do something like that or not, but rather you would allow yourself to take one step of life at a time and allow God to unfold His plans and purposes for your life. I'll start first with how I met Cliff. Well, I'll never forget what Cliff first told me when I asked why he decided to pursue me. When we had never met in person before at that time, when we were living halfway across the world after we stumbled across each other's blogs. And this is what he told me. He said, "I know if I never tried to pursue you, I would regret it for the rest of my life." Friend, has there been a dream in your heart stirring to be revived too? Something that you think about and makes your heart flutter. It makes you feel alive. And yet, when you think about the possibility of it never being pursued, a sense of dread fills in your heart. Maybe you're a mom waiting to be released from your stay-at-home duties, or a dad for that matter, because Cliff was also a stay-at-home dad for a while. Maybe you're an office worker clocking in and out of long, weary days. Maybe you're at the brink of taking a leap to be honest with someone in your relationship, but you're too afraid to rock the boat. I've been through all of that, and I want you to know you are not alone. This season of risk isn't about being fearless, foolish, or reckless. Rather, it's about what it means to trust God when everything logical says, don't. And maybe you're thinking, oh, but I'm not one of those super Christians, who can just hop on a plane and sell my house for the gospel. Or I'm not one of those Holy Spirit Christians who hears God whispering in my ear all the time. Well, you don't need to be. The truth is that research tells us that every single day, we are unconsciously making thousands of decisions for our lives. And in every yes or no, we are taking risks. They are either tiny ones that stretch our faith or shrink it. This is one of my favorite quotes from John Piper's book called Don't Waste Your Life. He writes, "The enchantment of security lets us take risks every day for ourselves, but paralyzes us from taking risks for others on the Calvary road of love. We are deluded and think that it may jeopardize a security that in fact does not even exist." I've always wondered what this enchantment of security is, and I think it's what we perceive to give us stability. Whether it's staying in the same job, staying on the same path in our careers, staying put, because it gives us the illusion of security and control. But yes, over time I realized that it is an illusion. Because who can or cannot predict if staying under a toxic boss will or will not erode your mental health to breaking point even with a large paycheck? Who can predict that a fire might or might not break out in your home while staying in a developed country instead of a developing country which you might be afraid to move into? Who can say if your children might or might not be bullied in the top school that you tried so hard to get into because you thought it might secure their success? We take risks every single day without realizing it. Many of us drive. I personally don't. I have a license, but I'm too afraid to drive most of the time. And guess what? Road traffic accidents are one of the highest percentage of death globally among young people. We invest in markets that can crash. We apply for jobs in a world filled with charming but narcissistic leaders. So all these are risks that we willingly take every day without even the blink of an eye. But sometimes I wonder, when God does call us out of our comfort zones, when love requires us to step out of our comfort zone, to dare to dream, to take a chance, to give sacrificially, suddenly we retreat. Why? And I think it's because we mistake control for security. And yet, as the quote says, security is a mirage. The job, the savings, the reputation, none of those things can shield us from life's unpredictable losses or sufferings. The only real safety is surrender. Over the years, I've learned that obedience to God often requires risk. But unless we exercise those faith muscles in small, everyday choices, it will be really difficult to have the strength for the big leaps when they come. So I hope to share a few stories that have happened in our personal lives, our professional callings, and in the bigger dreams that God has written into our lives. And I hope that they will give you hope and encouragement for you to take the step that you've been waiting for as well. In my early 20s, I remember when Cliff proposed, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, this is so insane. Like, this is the ridiculous story of like marrying my online stalker. I never met his friends or family. The first time I met his parents was on our wedding day in Singapore. Like, seriously, we had stumbled upon each other's blogs like by accident through like a Google search. And we weren't even looking for anything romantic. Like, it was really, really an accident. So some of you might have watched a viral YouTube video called The Wonderful Story of Cliff and Wai Jia. And so you'll know how we met. It was really, really incredulous. And if you know our story about how God literally stopped 2 planes for us, you'll understand why I knew he was putting faith in me to take a risk on Cliff. And yet at the time, I remember, being somebody who was super cautious. I was really afraid to be in a relationship. And in fact, there was a very charming boy at church who was a potential suitor, and he seemed to tick off all the checkboxes. And then there was Cliff. It was like a wild card, like he defied all the rules in the rule book. I should be able to see him among his friends. I should be able to know people in common circles so that I could evaluate him. And yet God took away all that because he really wanted me to trust in God. And 13 years later, here we are. Just a few weeks ago, we celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary. And I'm reminded of the tremendous risk that God called us to take on our wedding day 13 years ago. I remember this crazy stirring in our hearts one day when we felt God challenging Cliff and I to gift all our wedding gifts to the poor. In particular, it was to 2 anti-sex trafficking ministries, one in Cambodia and one in India. And in Asia, as many of you know, among Chinese people especially, receiving red packets filled with money is a cultural practice. And this is used, of course, to offset the tremendous costs of a wedding. When we first felt this nudge in our hearts from God, it felt so silly, so risky. And when more people found out about it, they warned us against it, saying that it was really, really unwise to start marriage on a financially risky footing. I mean, Cliff was a missionary at the time, and I was just a young doctor who had just started working. But the more we prayed, the more convinced that we were that God wanted us to start our union together with this step of faith. The night before the wedding, I actually had cold feet and I bargained with God. Oh, is it possible for us? Maybe we'll just donate the profits, and not every single love gift. After all, there are still costs to cover, like the food and different aspects of the wedding. But God reminded me of his lavish love and how he had sent a stranger to cover the costs of all my wedding flowers. How a friend's dad, whom I had never met before, also decided to contribute $10,000 to our wedding ceremony when there was no need to. When I thought about all those unexpected surprises from God, I realized that what he was asking from me was not a lot. So I said yes. And even then, my heart broke knowing that we weren't able to afford the garden wedding I always wanted. And it felt so silly. I told myself, oh, this is just a little girl's dream. There are more important things for God to think about. You're going to be a missionary, start to live simply, expect simply, and don't have all these fairy tale kind of, whimsical thoughts. But, as a little girl, or the little girl inside me rather, I still missed having that garden wedding, which I thought would never happen for good. 6 months later, when Cliff's friends from Canada, where he's from, offered to buy our air tickets so we could have a wedding ceremony back in Canada, my hopes revived. Because in Singapore, it was too expensive to have a garden wedding. We had it at church. So I thought, oh, wow, is God opening up a new door? Like, was this now the time? But as I wrote to more and more wedding venues in Canada, my heart became like lead. It just sank deeper and deeper inside me because all the emails wrote back saying, your budget is too small, it's too late. It was already January at the time, and most wedding venues for the summer in June were already booked a year in advance. As you know, Canada has 4 seasons, and the most popular season is summer. Then one day in February, closer to my birthday, out of nowhere, I received an email from one of the world's top 10 wedding destinations, Toronto Botanical Gardens. The lady had written back saying, every single day, I receive hundreds of emails. And for some reason, I opened yours and I even watched your testimony video. And I'd like to ask, we would love to sponsor your wedding as part of our newly launched perennial gardens this summer. If you can let us use your wedding photos for our advertisements in future. What do you think? I remember when I got that email, like my jaw dropped to the ground. Like I was flabbergasted. Like, where did this come from? And when I look back at our wedding photos, when I look back on that day, I think about all the costs that went into that garden wedding. And it occurred to me one day that although it felt so incredibly foolish and risky to give away all of the money from our wedding, I think it amounted to close to $60,000 or more. The costs of that sponsored wedding was probably above and beyond what we had given up. Who would have thought that God would use that at the start of our marriage to show us that we can never outgive his generosity? It just reminds me, when we were invited to go back to Canada, Cliff and I, we agreed, we said that if we couldn't get a wedding venue, we would just have a very simple ceremony in a white dress that I had bought. A simple white dress, like off the rack from a shop in one of his friend's backyard. And in the end, guess what? When I actually went back to the Singapore boutique shop where I had rented my wedding gown for the Singaporean wedding, the lady I felt was an angel sent by God. As you know, in many wedding boutiques or wedding shops, their goal is to help you spend more and more money. It's their job. It's what they do. And so when I went to return the wedding gown, because I'd rented it, I was expecting the lady to tell me, oh, why don't you rent another one? When I shared with her that I was also going to return to Canada for a second ceremony. And instead, what shocked me, this really shocked me out of my socks. That's how I describe it. She said, oh, 你要去加拿大做多一个婚礼啊？好啦，这些都是 premium 的群，你来选一个。In English, it means that she said she had an entire new rack of premium dresses that had just come in. And she was asking me to choose a brand new gown at no extra cost. She said, why don't you just return this one and take another one? It's like no difference to us. And I stood there waiting for the bomb to drop, like maybe there was a catch to it, and there was none. So I got to choose a brand new wedding gown off a premium selection for no added cost at all. And that reminds me, friends, that whenever obedience feels like a risk, it feels like risk because of the tangible possibility of loss that we envision. But God's generosity and lavish love covers our losses and turns it into gain, again and again. Luke 6:36 says, "Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together and running over, will be poured into your lap." In God's kingdom, I'm learning that our perceived losses will always turn back to gain, even if we have to walk through grief. And that's why our risk-taking in God is worth it. Even right now, as I'm sharing these stories, I'm sitting in a home that is a temporary home. This is our fourth accommodation in 5 months. And that is because after moving to Tanzania, we faced many challenges living in the first home that we were in, and then we had to move out. And it was just a few days before we had to leave our accommodation that Norwegian missionary friends of ours wrote to us and said that they had a guest house that nobody was taking. And in fact, somebody had cancelled their stay with them. So we got to stay with them in the past 3 months. And because they have new guests coming in, we have just recently moved out again to this other home. And as every time we move, of course, I think about the losses. Of course, I think about the toll that it takes on our family. And yet every time we reach a new place, I'm always so amazed by how God puts in so much joy in our two little girls. And looking at life from their perspective, it reminds me how in awe they are of God's goodness. Every time we move, I'm always shocked when they tell me, "Wow, Mummy, this house is better than the last. Look at this, it has that." And even though objectively I can't agree with them all the time, I feel that it is their childlike perspective and their incredibly, profoundly deep trust in God that helps them see God as such a good father. And that's what I want to learn too. I'd love to share with you another story. This one is a little bit more on a professional kind of aspect. I know some of you might be doing different kinds of jobs. Maybe you're in office work, maybe you have to organize projects, etc. And well, this one concerns the calligraphy exhibition that some of you might know about. And I'll never forget the day when I sensed God nudging me to hold this calligraphy exhibition to raise funds for my then Singapore entity of my nonprofit, Kitesong Global. I remember standing at the altar call, and when I felt this download from God, I thought to myself, an art gallery? Seriously? That hardly sounds heroic. Like, why risk it? And besides, I wasn't a famous artist. I didn't have sponsors. I didn't know where to begin. And I had not even written Chinese calligraphy for like over 20 years. It was something I dreaded and hated because every weekend I would have to write for 3 to 4 hours, and there was no joy in that exercise. I did not know God, so I never went to church. And every time I wrote character after character, I remember at the end of the day, it would just be a thick pile, and the teacher would just circle in red marks all the parts that were not perfect. And I just felt that, like, wow, God gave me that dream to redeem an art form that once enslaved me to perfectionism, to turn it into a message of grace and redemption. I remember one day, Cliff was driving me to meet sponsors, and I was literally trembling and whispering in my seat. And I said, God, give me more faith. And the moment I said those words, I remember a van drove past us and ahead of us. And on the van was painted the words, Faith Logistics. I remember being so shocked that I actually took my phone out and I had to take a photo of it. That coincidence, so-called, that divine coincidence, that divine visual that God gave to me, put faith in me to trust Him. But guess what? When we got to the meeting venue, when we met all the board members, the meeting went very badly. The people said that my work wasn't Christian enough, and they said that it didn't fulfill their guidelines because they wanted calligraphy that was overtly Christian. And they withdrew their support. I stood my ground. I said that the synopses were, Christian, and I felt that the vision that God had given me was very nuanced. But nonetheless, it was not convincing. they withdrew their support, and I just realized that with the event already announced, just a couple more days, I had no money to pay the vendors. I was $30,000 short. I just wept and I wept and I wept all the way home. I remember sitting on the steps of the shopping center, and this, big uncle who was driving a truck, he just came to me and he's like, "Hey, Xiao Mei Mei, you okay or not?" I think he was worried that I was going to do something drastic or something. I just wept and I wept and I wept. And I remember that evening when I shared with Cliff what had happened, he looked at me and he said, Wai Jia, if this is from God, then the price is worth paying for. And he looked at me with those, crash landing on you eyes, and he lovingly said, Wai Jia, if nobody will sponsor you, I will sponsor you. And I remember being so touched, Cliff is just, he knows how to say the right things all the time, but, or not all the time, but, at the right times, he knows how to say the right things. I remember just like laughing at him and saying, "Hello, Cliff, your money is my money lah," I told him tongue in cheek. And at the time, he was also a stay-at-home dad, so it was an internally funny joke. But I think I felt his heart, because at the end of the day, we both see our money as being money together. It's not that I was earning and he was not. We're a team. And so at the end of the day, I felt what Cliff was trying to convey to me was, if God has given us this vision, then we'll go through it together. But guess what? An hour later, the same sponsors emailed back. And they said that after discussing more, they felt that they had to take responsibility for their own internal miscommunication. And not only would they fund the entire project, guess what? After the venue of the first calligraphy exhibition, they continued to give us another 2 exhibition sites. And so this little dream that I hardly had faith for became a multi-site exhibition in 3 of the most prestigious malls in Singapore. It was really one of those Red Sea moments. Hebrews 11:29 says, "By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do the same, they were drowned." It is the same action of crossing the Red Sea, and yet 2 very different outcomes happened. The Israelites had a 100% chance of drowning unless God intervened, and yet the Egyptians who acted out of gumption and presumption sank. What a contrast. The Israelites survived because of faith, and the Egyptians did not, because they did not go in faith. What a contrast. And I realized that, wow, friends, that's the difference. It's faith. So I'm learning that faith does not remove the risk. It is still there. Rather, it gives it purpose and buoys it. I've seen this pattern again and again. For example, just recently, I questioned myself on spending money to attend a trauma recovery conference in Oxford. I felt that it was something God wanted me to do because I'm embarking on a book on trauma recovery. And yet, I kept doubting myself. Oh, it's so much money. The pound's currency is very strong. And, when you do the conversion, it makes you like, it's so much money. Just even for the conference ticket itself. But guess what? Cliff encouraged me. He said, Wai Jia, it's something you got to do. I really support you. I want you to spend this on yourself. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to bite the bullet and do it. And guess what? On the day of my departure from Tanzania, 2 different people, one friend, one stranger, sent 2 identical love gifts to me on that same morning. And together, they covered the cost of the trip. No one knew the amount. I never told them. And yet, God, I think, orchestrated those 2 very timely gifts at the same time with the same amount to help me see, Wai Jia, what else do you want that I cannot provide for if you follow me? What risk is too great for you to take? It reminds me of the time when Cliff and I first went to Uganda over 10 years ago. At that time, we also went as missionaries. We did not have salaries. And at the end of that year, I remember, we came home to Singapore, not only provided for, but with enough to bless others. Now, this is quite insane because we did not go with a mission agency. We did not do the traditional fundraising to reach a certain target before we left. In fact, now, even in our season now, we're not supported by a single mission agency. We're not given a regular salary. We're not, we did not fulfill the criteria of, having to reach a certain target before we left on the field. We just simply felt that if the God was calling us, then we would go. And I always remember in Uganda, we were so afraid that we would not have enough. When we got back to Singapore after that 1 year, that short-term mission stint, we were actually discussing like, oh, with this leftover money, which other missionaries do we want to support? And so it reminds me again of the lavishness of God. Some of you might be thinking, doing long-term missions or doing long-term humanitarian work, going to a different country is too crazy. Like, can't do it. Too much going on in my life right now. It's too crazy. And I totally understand. But guess what? I believe that God gives us a dream that is unique to each of us. It doesn't have to be relocating your family. It can be going on a short-term recce trip. It can be going to visit a missionary family. It can be starting a new project in your job. It can be changing your job. It could be becoming a stay-at-home parent. It could be homeschooling your kids. There are so many possibilities, and all of them are risky. Well, since I'm speaking from Tanzania, I'll share one thing about our recce trip. Well, the cost was huge because Africa is very far away from Singapore. And in order to have good quality living conditions for our family, the expenditure can really add up. And I remember when we planned to go on this recce trip, it was very God-led because I was actually hesitating. I had written to a couple of hospitals there in Tanzania. None of them had replied. And Cliff said, oh, let's just show up without an appointment. And I'm like, you're crazy. And he's like, no, it's not. We'll just go and talk and meet them in person. And I told Cliff, I said, look, I'm not that crazy. I do believe in having faith, but that's a bit too crazy. So I told him, if God were to open a crack of a door for us to go to Tanzania, I'll say yes. And guess what? Cliff was competing in the World Transplant Games in Perth. Again, that's another God story. I'll share it another time. But I got a phone call from one of my mentors who's a doctor, and he said, oh, the Christian Medical Dental Fellowship is organizing its, conference every 2 or 4 years. And this year it's in Tanzania. Does this speak to you in any way? I just felt led to call you. And that was when I told Cliff, and Cliff went, I told you so. So that was how we decided to go to Tanzania for a recce trip. And I remember when the costs added up, I was really starting to hyperventilate. And yet a former mentee of mine who had volunteered for Kitesong Global, she had left us a while back and wrote back to me to say that she felt God impressing on her heart to give us a sum of money. And when I looked at the sum, I was really flabbergasted because it was pretty much her annual bonus. As I think about all these stories of provision, of the undeserving grace that we have received, I'm reminded again and again that it's not about how much faith I have or we have, but who our faith is in. I try to remind myself that a mustard seed is enough when the soil is trust. Today we live and serve in Tanzania. Life is challenging. Water, power, security, all these things are not certain. And so people tell us sometimes, they say, oh, you guys are so brave, so full of faith. But this is not something we take for granted. The faith did not come overnight. And every day we still wrestle with God. And we say, God, give us fresh faith because we need a fresh dose all the time, right? About 10 years ago, as you know, when we were in Uganda, I remember worrying sick about Cliff's health. And I share this because I know that before you embark on any big dream, there are always worries. They're not only financial worries, but sometimes there are very personal worries like health or whether you can bear the trials that come your way, whether you can. Is it really possible for me to quit my job to care for my ailing parent? Is it really possible to send my child with special needs to a different school or to homeschool them? I mean, there are all these doubts that we have. And in the same way, when God opened the door for us to go to Uganda, I wondered, whether it was really wise or whether it was good to go because Cliff could not take the yellow fever vaccine because of his transplant. And then as we were navigating this, who could have expected that one of my professors at the time from the National University Hospital, she reached out to us and she said that she was actually one of the World Health Organization experts who had written the yellow fever guidelines. And so she personally went to investigate exactly where we would be serving. And she personally issued Cliff a waiver letter to share that, where we were was not endemic for yellow fever. And even though there is a risk, the risk is calculated. And so she wrote him the waiver letter, and that's how God opened the door for us to go. And later, while we were in Uganda, I was very desperate to find a hepatologist because if something happened to Cliff and his liver, I would like some reassurance that I know there's someone who can care for him. So we went to the best hospital in the city, which was quite a while away. And I remember wandering through the hospital trying to look for the department. And guess what? There was no hepatology department. So I walked out of the hospital feeling very dejected. I had such a weight in my heart. And I told myself, oh God, like what's going to happen? Like this is very risky. It feels risky for me as his wife. And I remember at that time, I did suffer from panic attacks, or I would break out in cold sweats in the middle of the night, just like, waking up and feeling like, oh my gosh, is Cliff still around? Is he alive? It was quite terrifying. And I think that's how anxiety plays in our minds also when we take risks. But guess what? As I walked out of the hospital, this African man dressed in white, he came up to me and he said, are you lost? So that's a way of asking, do you need help? And I said, yeah, I'm looking for a hepatologist. And he said, oh, okay. I'm the medical director of this entire hospital. And he said, this is my personal number. And he gave me his name card. And I looked at him and he continued. He said, if anything were to happen to your husband, or if you need any sort of medical care or evacuation, I myself will personally see to it. I stood there, I remember, and I felt overwhelmed and overtaken by the Holy Spirit. I was so shocked. I could have just crumbled on the floor. But at that point in time, I really felt like God freed me from the fear of losing Cliff. And since then, I actually have not had panic attacks about losing Cliff. So some of you know about the recent health crisis we had in Tanzania. We had to fly back to Singapore. It was all very dramatic. But even then, I felt like God has got us. And I realized that all these faith encounters are exactly what we need to build our faith muscles. Even when the risks were real, God held the waters up for us. But what if our risk-taking ends with a sad story? What if our risk-taking doesn't have a happy ending? What if Cliff dies? What if the wedding in the Botanical Gardens didn't happen? What if the calligraphy exhibition ended up in us going bankrupt? I think that's why many of us are afraid of taking risks, me included. I'll share a little bit more about the return trip that we had to make to Singapore a few months ago. Cliff had an unknown infection. He had a high fever for over a week, even with medication. And, one person, it came across to me more like a troll, accused me of putting Cliff's life at risk by serving in Africa and things like that. So, of course, when I read that message, we were actually in transit from Tanzania to Doha to Singapore. And when I read that message, I was actually in Doha. And to be honest, I did think like, oh, wow, like, am I really that irresponsible? Like, were we foolish? Is this where the naysayers, are right when they wag their fingers and go, see, I told you it was risky. How can you be so irresponsible? But I'm really learning that the measure of how worthwhile our risk-taking is ought not to be measured by a snapshot in time, but by our relationship with God. Maybe there might be times that, yes, we could have discerned wrongly, but I really believe that God, as a loving Father, isn't going to smite his beloved people for it. And maybe, just maybe, I want to offer this thought to you, that we ought not to assume that walking in God's will comes without its hardships and costs too. So I think to myself, in this particular context, it just means that just because Cliff had a health crisis, it doesn't mean that we all made a mistake in coming to Tanzania. It could simply mean that this is a chapter that God is writing. But I think a more accurate key to measuring out this decision would be, were you walking with God? And was it what you felt he was telling you to do? Cliff, as far as I know, is one of the most calculated risk takers. He's an adult. He has his own, decision-making capabilities. He's lived with a liver transplant for over 2 decades. He still chooses to raise Ironmans, to live fully, to serve wholeheartedly. And I think that's why I fell in love with him. Because to him, that is faith in action. It's trusting in a God who does not withhold or dampen our dreams just because of a setback. I don't think that just because someone has a chronic illness or a disability, that they should not pursue their dreams. In fact, he will tell you that it's not recklessness, but obedience, because faith always carries risk. Right now, in this season of life, I'm also at the brink of exploring another pivot in my career, in my life, one that I'll share with you in due time. But I've wrestled with questions like, did I waste my years in medicine? After all, I'm not like a practicing surgeon. I don't do clinical medicine, I do public health. And maybe some of you in your midlife have also wondered, did what I study in university get wasted because I'm not a stay-at-home parent, or I'm doing something completely different? And I personally believe that in God's kingdom, nothing is wasted. So I'm taking small, risky steps forward. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I will be successful, but I know that in God's kingdom, absolutely nothing is wasted. And He measures our outcomes. He measures the outcomes of our lives in a way far different than the world does. So for those of you who often wonder as well, if your obedience to God will jeopardize your kids, I hope you will always remember Psalm 37, verse 25. I was young and now I'm old, and yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. I didn't fully know if schooling my girls in Tanzania would be good for them. Is it safe? Is the education robust enough? Was it worth us moving our homes, quitting our jobs for? Was there really a life-changing project waiting for us here to impact people and communities? These were questions we couldn't answer. But we just knew one thing, that every step of obedience requires faith, precisely because of the risks of the unknown. And I'm learning that how God measures our fruitfulness is far different from that of the world's. Someone else might conclude like, your risk was not worth taking. But I'll tell you this with a wink of an eye, that no one, absolutely no one, but yourself and God can measure that. I'll be honest with you, this season here in Tanzania has been particularly slow for me. The community health projects that I had hoped to kick off and to continue to snowball into something bigger has stagnated and in fact even dwindled. We've been here for a year and a half and we haven't seen, grand things like communities change, crusades. I haven't seen myself achieving groundbreaking statistics to show you, these are the number of lives changed, people we've converted, things that we've done. But instead, we've faced water and power outages. We've faced continual moves. I have been groped. We live in an area where armed robberies are not uncommon. I've been diagnosed with complex trauma. It all sounds very scary, right? So if I measure how worthwhile our decision was based on all these outcomes, then it would be very easy to conclude that, oh man, it wasn't worth the risk at all. But God Himself had to reveal to me, Wai Jia, that the greatest gift is the gift of knowing Him. The gift of freeing myself from what I was enslaved to before, my work, platform, my popularity. And from there, I'm trusting that from this new season of my life, that a new, fresh relationship will be birthed with Him, deeper than I have ever experienced before. And that at some point that He will use my life for His good and glory. My gift of knowing Him will then surpass the hardships that I've faced. Will I always feel that way? I don't know. But I think that's the messy journey we call life. And that's okay. My hope is that this season will remind you, friend, don't let fear of failure, don't let setback or naysayers hold you back. All those are real and valid, but they are not final. So friends, the stories that you'll hear in this season are so precious to me because you're going to hear lives and stories about people who dared to risk in love, in career, in calling, and in obedience. And I pray that they will give you courage to say yes to whatever God is stirring in your heart. Because if you never try, you will never know. Maybe today you're listening from a place that feels safe, but small. Maybe God has been nudging you towards something that makes no sense on paper or to the world. This is your reminder that if you wait for the perfect conditions, you will never move. But if you take one trembling step in obedience after another, you will find solid ground where there should have been none. So what's the risk in front of you today? Would you trust Him enough to take it? Let us pray together. Dear Lord, I thank You for every single person listening in right now. And I just pray that You would revive the dream that You have placed in our hearts and help us to trust You. Help us not to measure the outcome of our obedience to You through KPIs that the world measures us with. But instead, we pray that You will help us to see that what matters to You the most is our obedience. And from there, we pray that a deep relationship with You and others will just be an outflow, and that our world will be transformed by the witness of our faith and trust in You. So give us courage to take risks, Lord, for You and with You. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you, friends. I hope you'll enjoy this season as much as I did. If you enjoy this podcast, would you do me a favor? Leave a review on the podcast so that more people can discover what it means to dream bravely for Christ. And if you know someone you think would be wonderful for me to interview, or if that person's you, drop me a note at hello@kitedreams.org. See you next time.